June 9th, 1912. Villisca, Iowa. Population just over 2,500. It was a Sunday evening, and the town smelled like cut grass and coal smoke from the passing trains. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, age 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, had spent the night at the Presbyterian Church for a children's program. 2 more girls came home with them, Lena Stillinger, 12, and her younger sister Ina, 8. It was supposed to be an ordinary sleepover. By sunrise, all 8 of them were dead. Doctors would later place the time of the killings somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning. Every victim had suffered severe blows to the head from an axe, the same one that belonged to Josiah Moore. It was found propped against a wall in the guest room downstairs where the Stillinger girls had been sleeping. The next morning, a neighbor named Mary Peckham noticed something was wrong. No lights, no movement. No one had come out to start the day, and it was already past 7. She tried the Moore's back door and found it locked from the inside. When she couldn't raise anyone, she called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Ross let himself in through the same door. He made it as far as the downstairs guest room before he came back out, pale, and told Mary Peckham to call the town marshal. The marshal, Henry Horton, arrived within minutes. What he found upstairs matched what Ross had already seen below. Every bed in the house held a body. Josiah had been struck more times than anyone else in the house, so many times that his face was barely recognizable. What investigators found in the hours after is what still keeps this case circulating more than 100 years later. Every mirror inside the house had been covered, with clothing pulled from the closets and hung over the glass. The windows had been covered too, with skirts and other garments blocking the view from outside. In the kitchen, someone had left a plate of food untouched, and a bowl of bloody water sat nearby, as if the killer had paused to wash before leaving. There was more. A kerosene lamp was found upstairs with the glass chimney removed, and the wick turned down low, just enough to see by without being seen. Out in the barn, investigators found a shallow impression in the hay, positioned next to a knothole in the wall, one that lined up with a clear view of the Moore house. 2 cigarette butts were recovered from the attic, a detail that suggested whoever did this had been inside long before the family ever got home from church, waiting and smoking in the dark. Robbery was ruled out early. Josiah's wallet, still holding cash, was untouched in his pants pocket. Investigators also noted something specific to Lena Stillinger. Unlike the other victims, her body showed signs that she had woken and tried to fight back, with a defensive wound found on her arm. She was also the only victim found positioned differently than how she would have been sleeping, and her clothing had been disturbed in a way that led some investigators to suspect an assault, though nothing was ever confirmed. Word spread through Villisca within the hour, and it didn't take long before crowds had pushed past whatever perimeter existed, walking straight through the crime scene before it could be properly preserved. Neighbors, reporters, and curious townspeople moved through the bedrooms and handled objects at the scene. In 1912, there was no protocol for any of this. Whatever evidence hadn't already been disturbed by the killer covering his tracks was compromised by the town itself within hours. A coroner's inquest opened the next day, June 11th. It stalled almost immediately. The county attorney and the sheriff clashed over jurisdiction, and within the first week, at least 2 separate men calling themselves detectives had inserted themselves into the case, each chasing his own theory. each certain the other was wasting time. On June 12th, the town buried all 8 victims together. Thousands attended. The funeral procession stretched 50 carriages long, and National Guardsmen were brought in just to keep the street clear. The investigation that followed lasted the better part of a decade. A private detective agency was brought in. A state-funded Bureau of Criminal Investigation was created partly in response to the case. Dozens of names were floated. The one that stuck longest belonged to a traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly. Kelly had arrived in Villisca for the first time the morning of the murders, in time to watch the Stillinger girls perform at the same Children's Day service the Moore family attended that evening. He left town on a 5:19 a.m. train the following morning, and several passengers later claimed he told them, hours before the bodies were even found, that 8 people back in Villisca had been butchered in their beds while they slept. Kelly returned to town 2 weeks later, talked his way onto an official tour of the Moore house by posing as an out-of-town detective, and was only exposed once police looked into his background. Years afterward, following an unrelated arrest for mailing obscene material, Kelly gave investigators a detailed confession to the Villisca murders. He was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second ended in acquittal. Other names came and went. Frank Jones, an Iowa state senator and a former employer of Josiah Moore's, was investigated over a business rivalry between the two men and rumors of a personal grudge. But payroll records placed him working several hundred miles away in Illinois at the time, and he was released for lack of evidence. That didn't stop plenty of people in Villisca from believing it was him anyway. A drifter named Andrew Sawyer, who reportedly slept fully clothed with an axe by his own bed, was questioned and let go. So was a man named Henry Moore, no relation to the family, whose name surfaced when an investigator began linking the case to a string of similar axe murders in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois. That pattern is what keeps researchers coming back to this case more than a century later. In the years just before and after 1912, at least 4 other families were killed the same way. In their own beds, at night, in towns the killer had no obvious connection to. Windows and mirrors were covered at more than one of those other scenes, the same way they were in Villisca. If it was one person, he came through Iowa once and was never identified again. No one was ever convicted. The house still stands in Villisca today, restored to its 1912 condition, down to the same iron beds the victims died in. People still walk through those rooms. Most come out saying the same thing, that something about the quiet in that house doesn't feel like ordinary quiet. 8 people went to sleep in a small Iowa farmhouse, expecting an unremarkable Monday. Somewhere in that house that night, someone else was already waiting, patient enough to smoke 2 cigarettes in the dark and watch a family come home from church one last time. Whoever it was covered the mirrors before he left. No one has ever been able to say why. April 11th, 1981, Keddie, California. A small resort community tucked into the Sierra Nevada, built around a railroad hotel and a handful of cabins strung along Keddie Station Loop Road. Cabin 28 belonged to Sue Sharp, 36, and her 5 children. She'd moved the family west 2 years earlier after leaving her husband in Connecticut, first into a trailer, then into the cabin, which had previously been the local sheriff's residence. By the spring of 1981, the Sharps had settled into a routine. Sue was taking classes at the community college. The kids had made friends in the small handful of cabins around them. That Saturday started ordinary enough. Sue drove into nearby Quincy that afternoon with her daughter Sheila and picked up her son John, 15, and his friend Dana Wingate, 17, who'd been hitchhiking. She brought them back to Keddie so John could change, and by 3:30, the two boys had hitchhiked back into Quincy for a party. That evening, the rest of the family scattered the way kids in a small community usually do. Sheila, 14, walked next door to spend the night at the Seabolt's place in Cabin 27. Sue's younger sons, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, stayed home with their friend from Cabin 26, 12-year-old Justin Smart, who was sleeping over. 12-year-old Tina had been watching television at the Seabolt's as well, but came home around 9:30 to go to bed. John and Dana never made it back that night, or if they did, no one could later say exactly when. The next morning, April 12th, Sheila walked back to Cabin 28. The front door, which the family rarely locked, opened the way it always did. Nothing about the outside looked wrong. The lights were off. The curtains were drawn. Inside the living room, she found her mother, her brother John, and Dana Wingate. All three had been bound with electrical cord and medical tape. Investigators would later determine that Sue and John had been beaten with a hammer and then stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Dana had been struck with a separate hammer and strangled. In the room next door, Rick, Greg, and Justin Smart were found asleep and completely unharmed, close enough to hear anything that happened, and somehow, according to what they told police, they'd heard nothing at all. It took investigators hours at the scene to realize that someone was missing. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, was not in the house. For nearly 3 years, no one knew what had happened to her. The initial investigation, led by Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas, struggled almost immediately. There was no forced entry. A single unidentified fingerprint was lifted from a handrail on the back stairs. The phone had been left off the hook, and whoever had been inside had taken the time to shut off the lights and draw the curtains before leaving. Investigators found no clear motive, which made the case, in the words of one detective who worked it, the toughest kind to solve. The only account of what happened that night came from Justin Smart, the 12-year-old who'd been sleeping in the next room. He first told police he'd slept through everything. Later, under hypnosis, he described what he called a dream. In it, 2 men entered the cabin. One carried a hammer, the other a knife. He said Tina had woken up and walked into the living room to see what the noise was, and that one of the men carried her out the door and came back without her. Investigators had a sketch artist, a friend of the sheriff who wasn't a trained forensic artist, draw up the 2 faces Justin described. Whether Justin had witnessed the murders or imagined them entirely was never resolved. On April 22, 1984, a man collecting bottles for recycling in the woods near Feather Falls in Butte County, more than 60 miles from Keddie, found a human skull. Testing confirmed what investigators had feared for 3 years. It was Tina. Not long after the discovery made the news, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous phone call. The caller asked whether anyone had connected the remains to a 12-year-old girl who had gone missing from a murder scene in Plumas County a few years earlier. Whoever placed that call knew something. The recording of it was filed away and would not resurface for nearly 30 years. until a retired investigator, brought back onto the case in 2013, found it sitting untouched in the original case file. Because Tina was believed kidnapped, the FBI opened its own investigation into her disappearance in the days after the murders. They withdrew a few weeks later, in late April of 1981, satisfied that the state's Department of Justice had the case covered. It didn't. Rumors moved through Plumas County almost immediately. Some pointed to drugs, claiming Dana had been involved in stealing narcotics from local dealers, though Sheriff Thomas found no drugs in the cabin and dismissed the theory outright. Others focused on a rougher timeline. 3 years later, investigators would even rule out two notorious traveling killers, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, after their names were floated as possible suspects. The theory investigators kept returning to involved something closer to home. Sue and Martin Smart were rumored to be having an affair, and Sue had reportedly been encouraging Marilyn to leave a marriage she described as abusive. If Martin had learned that Sue was pushing his wife toward the door, investigators believed that was motive enough, and that Boubed, a friend with a rougher history who'd only been living in Keddie for 10 days, had been brought along to help. Two names surfaced early and never fully went away. Martin Smart, a cook who lived in Cabin 26, and his friend, John Boubed, who'd been staying with the Smarties for just over a week before the murders. Martin left Keddie for Reno not long after the murders. While there, he wrote a letter to Marilyn that investigators later called one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. In it, he told her he had paid the price of her love, and now he'd bought it with 4 people's lives. That letter sat in a file unentered as evidence for over 3 decades. There was more. A counselor Martin regularly saw at a veterans hospital in Reno later told investigators that Martin had confessed to killing Sue and Tina during a session in May of 1981, just weeks after the murders, while denying any involvement in what happened to the 2 boys. According to the counselor, Martin said Tina had to be taken because she'd seen the whole thing. In 2016, investigators recovered a hammer from a pond a short distance from where Cabin 28 once stood. It matched the type of weapon Martin had told police back in 1981 he was missing from his own home. Martin Smart died in 2000. John Boubede died in 1988. Neither man was ever charged. Cabin 28 stood for another 2 decades after the murders before it was finally torn down in 2004. Locals had stopped renting it out years earlier. Cabin 26, where the Smarties once lived, is still standing today. More than 4 decades later, the case remains open. Investigators have said they believe at least 2 people who know exactly what happened that night are still alive. 3 children slept through whatever happened in that cabin, close enough to have heard it, and never did. And somewhere between that living room and a stretch of woods 60 miles away, a 12-year-old girl was carried out into the dark. And no one has ever said under oath exactly who carried her. June 2014, Westfield, New Jersey. A quiet, affluent commuter town, the kind with tree-lined streets and a school system people move across the state for. Derek and Maria Broaddus had just closed on a 6-bedroom house at 657 Boulevard for $1.3 million. Maria had grown up in Westfield, just a couple of streets over, and the house was supposed to be the place she raised her own 3 kids, ages 5, 8, and 10, close to where she'd raised herself. They didn't move in right away. The house needed work, so through the summer they spent evenings there, painting and planning renovations, while still living in their old place across town. 3 days after closing, Derek checked the mailbox and found a plain white envelope. No return address, just 2 handwritten words on the front. The new owner. Inside was a typed letter. It opened almost warmly, welcoming whoever had bought the house, asking if 657 Boulevard had called out to them. Then it turned. The writer explained that the house had been the subject of their family for decades, and that, as it approached its 110th birthday, they'd been put in charge of watching and waiting for what they called its second coming. Later in the letter, the tone shifted again, calling the house's high price a symptom of greed, and claiming that greed was exactly what had brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard. And now it had brought the Broadduses to them. It closed by wishing them a happy moving-in day and reminding them that they'd be watched. It was signed simply, The Watcher. Derek called the Westfield Police Department that night. An officer came out, looked around, and told him there wasn't much that could be done beyond securing the property. Derek and Maria also reached out to John and Andrea Woods, the couple they'd bought the house from, to ask if anything like this had happened before. It had. The Woods told them that in 23 years of living at 657 Boulevard, they'd received exactly 1 letter, just days before they moved out, thanking them for taking care of the house. Nothing threatening. They'd thrown it away without a second thought. For the Broaddus family, it wasn't going to be 1 letter. Between June and August of that year, as the family kept moving furniture and boxes into the house piece by piece, at least 3 more letters followed the first. Each one was more specific than the last. One referenced the family's minivan by description. Another named the contractors doing the renovation work by the jobs they were hired for, as if the writer had watched them come and go through the front gate. One mentioned a specific child who liked to paint on the porch and asked, "Is she the artist in the family?" Another referred to the children collectively as young blood and asked whether they'd found all the secrets the house held yet. Whether the young blood would play in the basement or whether they were too afraid to go down there alone. Because if the letter's author were them, they'd be very afraid. The basement, the letter pointed out, was far enough from the rest of the house that if you were upstairs, you'd never hear them scream. One letter referenced the Woods family directly, claiming they had sold the house at the Watcher's request, calling it, quote, their time to move on. Another claimed that every window and door in 657 Boulevard had let the writer watch the family move through their own home, and stated flatly that they had been in control of the house for the better part of 2 decades already. The Broadduses never spent another night getting the house ready. They stayed in their old home and started trying to figure out who was doing this. They hired a private investigator who staked out the surrounding houses for weeks and later said the neighbors didn't seem normal, though nothing he found ever led anywhere concrete. They also brought in a former FBI profiler who assessed the language and handwriting in the letters and concluded the writer was likely someone in their 50s or 60s living somewhere nearby, close enough to know the family's routines without ever having to guess. Webcams were eventually installed around the property itself, watching the street for anyone who lingered too long. The Westfield Police Department and later the Union County Prosecutor's Office both opened investigations. A neighbor pointed to a man living next door as a possible suspect, though nothing tied him conclusively to the letters. Another letter, similar in tone, reportedly arrived at a different house on the same block during the same stretch of time, though few details about it were ever released. In 2018, After the case resurfaced in a national magazine story that finally printed the letters in full, prosecutors asked residents near 657 Boulevard to voluntarily submit DNA samples for comparison against material recovered from one of the envelopes. Some complied, others didn't. No match was ever announced. No one was ever charged. No suspect was ever named publicly. In 2015, the Broadduses sued the Woods family, alleging they had known about the watcher and failed to disclose it before the sale. The lawsuit dragged the whole situation into public court filings and depositions, laying out letter after letter for the record and drawing national reporters to a town that had never wanted the attention. The Woods denied withholding anything and pointed out that the single letter they'd received had contained nothing threatening at all. The family never lived in the house they had bought. They spent roughly $100,000 on renovations they would never get to enjoy, then tried to get permission from the town's planning board to tear the house down and split the lot in two, hoping to recoup something from the land itself, if not the house. They were denied. They put it on the market instead, and found that once the story became public, selling it wasn't simple. Speculation turned on the family itself for a while, with some in town suggesting the whole thing was an elaborate excuse for buyer's remorse, or even insurance fraud. No evidence ever supported either theory. In July of 2019, 5 years after the first letter arrived, the Broadduses sold 657 Boulevard for roughly $959,000, several $100,000 less than they paid for it. The new owners have said little publicly since. The letters stopped not long after the sale went through. No further correspondence has ever surfaced. Whoever wrote them knew things a passerby wouldn't. The children's ages, the renovation schedule, a specific habit belonging to one specific child, and they knew it all within days of a closing that hadn't even been publicly listed anywhere the average stranger would think to look. More than a decade later, the house at 657 Boulevard still stands on a quiet street in one of the safest towns in New Jersey. Somewhere nearby, or maybe not nearby at all, is someone who watched a family move boxes into a house they never got to live in, and who has never, not once, had to explain why.